Hi, second grade. Welcome to our math workshop for today. Today we are going to be learning about a new type of graph called a line plot. So for today's lesson, all that you're going to need is a piece of paper and something to write with. So get those materials ready and come back and join me. So today what I want to teach you is that we can use data from a tally chart to create line plots. And when we use line plots, it's because we're using measurement data. And we're going to go over what measurement data is and what that means. Also, I want you to remember and keep in the back of your mind that a line plot's horizontal axis is like a number line or a ruler. So remember, we've talked a little bit about axes and we're going to talk about them more today. The horizontal axis is the bottom axis on a graph, just like what you've seen in your pictographs and your bar graphs. So it's that bottom line on your graphs. So in line plots, that bottom line is going to look sort of like a number line. So let's get into what that's going to look like and go over some important information about line plots. All right, so we're going to review some more slides. So far we've done picture graphs, bar graphs, and now we're moving into line plots. So let's get started. So let's go over a little bit of information, just general things to know about line plots. So line plots are used with measurement data. Measurement data is something that could be measured with a ruler. Also, just like I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, a line plot's horizontal axis is like a number line. And I'm going to show you a little visual that's going to help you see that soon. It's also important that you know the shortest and the longest length measured in order to create a line plot. So let's do a little bit more investigating. Okay, so the measurement data we're going to be using today is hand spans. And you can see in this picture here, this is how you measure a hand span. So your hand span, you want to put your hand right at the edge of the ruler on the centimeter side, stretch your fingers out, and see what your hand span is. My hand span is 21 centimeters. Let's talk a little bit about why a hand span could be important. It can make a difference in sports. Some sports that involve throwing and catching, having a bigger hand can make it easier for you to catch or throw. In some sports, it can make it more challenging too. Also, if you are a musician playing piano, right, you have to be able to spread those fingers out, and the bigger your hands are, it can make a difference to your ability to play different instruments. If you have a ruler at home, you can try this out and see what your own hand span is. But I'm going to give you some imaginary data, just like I've been of another class's hand spans. Okay, so here I have room one's hand span data. I made up this data just like I've done for our other lessons. So all of our other data so far has been categorical. That's a big word. Try saying that one, categorical. That means that you choose a category or a favorite, right? The data that we've done so far has been room 81's favorite colors or room 42's favorite desserts. And then you ask people and they tell you what their favorite is, and that's how you get the data. This data is a little bit different. This data is based on measurement. So it's not a choice that you make. It's based on a number, right? I can't decide what my hand span is. I can't say, I want to say my hand span is 16 centimeters. No, I have to measure it and I have to find out what my hand span is. So measurement data is different than categorical data because it's based on numbers and you don't have a choice. It's just what the numbers show. So I have this tally chart here in the middle. This is called a tally chart, where I collected this pretend data. Is there anything that you notice about this tally chart that's different than some of the other ones we've looked at so far? One thing that I first noticed was different than some of the others was that I have these two numbers right here, 21 and 22, And they don't have any tallies, but I still included them on my chart. And we're gonna go over why that's important when we're working with measurement data. Because if it was just for categorical data, I could just take those out, right? If it was like, do you like dogs, cats, or fish the best? And nobody picked fish, I could just not put fish on the graph and it wouldn't matter. But in measurement data, it matters and we can't have any gaps. So even though that we have one here at 20 and here at 23 and none at 21 and 22, we still have to mark 21 and 22 on our graph. And I'm gonna show you what that looks like too.
Okay, so I'm going to use Room 1's data to create my line plot and teach you how it's done. So just like every other graph we've made so far, you are going to create your two axes. Your horizontal axis, remember horizontal means it goes across, so it's a horizontal axis. And your vertical axis. Vertical means it goes straight up and down. So this is your vertical axis. So I have my horizontal axis and my vertical axis. Okay, so the first thing that I mentioned is that you have to know your longest and your shortest measurements because those are going to help you with labeling your graph. So looking at the data I have here, which measurement is the shortest? 14 centimeters is the shortest. What about the longest? 23 centimeters is the longest. So when I am labeling my line plot, I'm gonna start before my smallest number and I'm gonna end one or two numbers after my biggest number. So my line plot that I'm gonna draw here, I'm gonna start at 13 and I'm gonna end at 24. So just like in the other graphs that we've been making, try to make the spaces in between your numbers fairly even. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you can make it even, that would be good. So I'm going to start labeling. So I labeled my graph 14 through 24. So 14 is my starting number. 24 is one past where I end, just to give me a little bit of room there. And you can see my lines aren't perfect, but they're close, right? They're not perfectly spaced out, but they're close. Okay, so now that we have our bottom axis labeled, you can see it looks kind of like part of a number line, right? We didn't skip any numbers, even though we have 21 and 22 that are gonna have no marks. We still included them because we don't want any gaps. When we're working with line plots, we have to include all the numbers, even if they don't have any tallies, okay? So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to label our horizontal axis. Remember, this is our horizontal axis. What do these numbers 14 through 24 represent? These aren't the numbers that represent people. These are the numbers that represent the length, and the length is in centimeters. So you're gonna write what these numbers represent. They represent length, and the length that we're using is centimeters. It's important that you put centimeters because if somebody saw your graph and they didn't know, they could think you were doing inches or feet or yards. It could be so many different things. So you have to make sure that you tell the person who's looking at your graph what you use to measure. And in this case, it's centimeters. Okay, so now we're gonna take a look at our vertical axis. And our vertical axis needs to be labeled the same way, meaning that there are no gaps anywhere on the graph. Once we start with a number, we have to keep going and we can't skip any numbers. So again, take a look at the totals. This one's a little bit trickier because they're not in order the way that the length are, but we have to figure out what the lowest total is and what the highest total is. So our lowest total here is 0. We have a couple of categories that have, we have a couple of lengths that have 0. So we're gonna start at 0 and let's see, what's the category with the most? I think that 16 centimeters has 7 people and that's the most. So when we're labeling the side of our graph, we're going to make sure that we start at 0. And that 0 is just gonna be right here on the line because it's going to mean that there's no marks for that length. So the 0 is just going to live right here in the corner, and then we're going to go up to about 7. Maybe I'll do 8 or 9 just so that I have a few extra spaces. So you're going to label, and remember, you're trying to keep it even in between each number. I like to add a line in between the numbers to make it even more clear where I'm going when I start drawing my graph. I did that down here too. Okay, so here we have the lengths, and then we have the number of people at those lengths. When you're making a line plot, you do not have to label your vertical axis. Once we add a title, the title should be able to show to the person who's looking at this graph what the numbers on our vertical axis mean. You have to label the bottom, the horizontal axis, because they wouldn't know the measurements. But you don't have to label the vertical axis, okay? All right, and of course we need to give it a title. So I'm going to give it a title. Let's see, I'm just gonna call this Handspans in room 1. So that's my title, okay? All right, so now I'm gonna show you how to create your line plot. And what you're going to do is basically each person or each tally represents one dot or X, okay? When I look at the length 14, how many tallies are there? How many people have a hand span of 14 centimeters? 3, right? So I'm gonna start here. Remember, this 0 means that there would be no mark, so we don't use the 0. We start right here with 1, and you can draw the dots.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
Now we move on to 15. How many people had a hand span of 15 centimeters? There were 5. And you're gonna repeat this with each row. And you want to kind of try to keep your data in straight lines. If you want to sort of give yourself like a little guide, you absolutely can, to keep it mostly straight. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, just to keep it mostly in line. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that with all of these. Okay, so I repeated that with all of these columns. I added a dot for each person who had the hand span. You might notice here at 21 and 22, there's no dot. No dots at 21 and 22 because there were no people who had that hand span. So now that I have all of my dots, we're gonna write our graph statements. Today, you just have to write 2 graph statements based on your graph. Remember, this is my example. I have your own set of independent data that you'll be using. So 2 graph statements. What can I learn from this graph? The most students had a 16 centimeter hand span. Okay. The longest hand span was 23 centimeters. Okay, boys and girls, let's go over the expectations for a line plot together one more time, and then I will show you your data for your own independent line plot.
So to review the requirements for a line plot, you have to know the longest and shortest measurements. Down here, we have the lengths. And you can see here that we kind of go a few before the shortest and a couple past the longest. You have to know your longest and shortest so that you can correctly label the horizontal axis, just like a number line. Remember that these numbers are continuous, and that means that there's no gaps. Just because there isn't a student who had a hand span of 21 or 22 centimeters, we still include it because there was one that had 23. We can't leave any numbers out. The horizontal axis is also labeled with what the numbers mean. So if we just had 10 through 25 written here with no explanation of what the numbers mean, it could be centimeters, it could be feet, it could be inches, it could be miles. The person reading your graph would never be able to be sure. So you have to make sure you tell them that it's length and what measurement of length, right? We're using centimeters. The vertical axis is also labeled with numbers. So we have to have our numbers on the axis, but you don't have to label them with a title. You don't have to give them a name like you do down here with the length. The line plot itself does need to have a title. The title should explain what the graph is showing, just like with bar graphs and pictographs. All right, now it's your turn. So please take this imaginary data and turn it into your own line plot. We're continuing to work with handspans, but in room 2 instead of room 1. All right, boys and girls, so when you are trying this out on your own, remember you just need a piece of paper. If you have access to graph paper at home, you can use graph paper to help you keep those lines super straight, but it's not a requirement. You can do it just like I did. Remember to add your graph statements after you create your graph, just 2 graph statements today. And be sure to add an attachment of your work before marking the assignment as done so that your teachers can take a look too. All right, boys and girls, have fun with your line plot. I can't wait to see you again later this week. Bye.